Okay, so you've been following this whole India-Canada thing, right?
Yeah.
It's big news, accusations flying, diplomats being expelled, talk of assassinations. I mean, it's got all the makings of a spy thriller.
It's definitely been escalating.
Right. But before we get too caught up in the day-to-day headlines, I kind of want to take a step back, really unpack how we even got to this point.
Well, and that's what's so fascinating here,
Okay.
right? Because it didn't just come out of nowhere. This is like the latest chapter in a story that's been going on for decades.
Okay, so set the stage for us. What's the backstory here? What do we absolutely need to understand?
So at the heart of it all is this thing called the Khalistan movement,
Okay.
which in a nutshell, it's a Sikh separatist movement. They want to create an independent homeland, they call it Khalistan, in the Punjab region.
And Punjab, that's in India, right?
Right, although it actually straddles both India and Pakistan.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Which, as you can imagine, adds a whole other layer of complexity to this whole thing.
Hmm.
But essentially, the Khalistan movement, it's driven by both religious and political motivations. They believe that, historically, Sikhs have faced a lot of discrimination and marginalization within India,
Right.
and they see an independent state as the solution.
Okay, so that's the Khalistan movement in a nutshell. But where does Canada fit into all of this?
Well, Canada has a very large and politically active Sikh diaspora,
Hmm.
and some of them support the Khalistan movement.
Okay.
So as you can imagine, that's always been a bit of a sticking point in India-Canada relations.
Hmm.
India has, for a long time, accused Canada of harboring Khalistani extremists and not doing enough to address their concerns.
And I imagine there's quite a history of diplomatic clashes over this.
Oh, absolutely. This is not a new issue for them.
So you have this underlying tension, this history, and then, boom, a murder happens.
The murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, a prominent Sikh leader living in Canada. He was gunned down outside a Sikh temple in British Columbia. And it wasn't just a random shooting, you know, masked gunmen, a very clearly targeted attack.
Yeah, it had all the signs of a professional hit.
Exactly.
And that's when things really blew up, right? Because Canada believes India was involved.
That's right. Canadian intelligence agencies suspect that Indian agents were behind the assassination.
Which is huge.
Oh, it's massive.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about a foreign government potentially carrying out an assassination on Canadian soil.
Right.
It's a direct attack on their sovereignty.
I've got to admit, even going into this deep dive, I don't think I'd fully grasped how serious of an accusation that is. So how did India respond to that?
They denied it
Mm,
completely.
of course.
They call the accusations completely baseless, politically motivated.
But here's where it gets really interesting, right? Because didn't India already label this guy, Nijjar, a terrorist
They did?
before the assassination even happened?
Yes. India had designated Nijjar as a terrorist for his alleged support of, you guessed it, the Khalistan movement. They claimed that he was involved in violent extremism and posed a direct threat to India's national security.
Which, I mean, it makes their denial, while expected, a little hard to swallow.
Right.
It does seem a little like they're trying to have it both ways, branding him a dangerous terrorist on the one hand, but then denying any involvement in his death on the other.
Yeah, and they'd say, look, he was dangerous, this guy was a genuine threat,
Right.
and that Canada was basically providing a safe haven, not just for him, but for other Khalistani extremists too.
Ignoring, turning a blind eye.
Exactly, basically letting them operate with impunity, and that's just not acceptable to them.
Right. So you can see how they end up with these two completely opposed narratives.
Totally.
And both sides seem to be digging in. Nobody's backing down.
Well, no. And I mean, look at how things have escalated. I mean, you've got expulsions, travel warnings.
Mm-hmm.
The gloves are off at this point.
It's full-blown diplomatic warfare.
It really is. And it might sound kind of polite on the surface, like, oh, we're expelling your diplomat.
Right.
But that is a huge insult. It's basically saying to the other government, we don't trust you. And that has a ripple effect. It impacts everything. I mean, we're talking trade, intelligence sharing, you name it.
And speaking of trade, that's the thing I keep thinking about through all of this, because India and Canada, I mean, they do a lot of business together, right?
Oh, billions of dollars, easily.
Yeah.
I mean, India is a huge market for Canadian exports. You've got everything from lentils to potash to energy products. And on the flip side, Canada imports a ton of stuff from India too. Manufactured goods, pharmaceuticals, IT services, you name it.
So this isn't just, political posturing. This has real-world economic consequences.
Oh, absolutely. And we're already starting to see it. I mean, there are businesses, especially in Canada, who rely heavily on trade with India, and they are feeling the pinch. And if this drags on, it could have much broader economic consequences for both countries.
Yeah, you could be talking about job losses, potentially even, a
Yeah.
slowdown.
And definitely a concern at this point.
And then, of course, there's the whole geopolitical dimension to this, too, because this isn't happening in a vacuum.
Not at all.
Hmm.
I mean, this is all playing out against a backdrop of some really significant geopolitical shifts that have been happening for a while.
Like what?
Well, on the one hand, you've got Canada. They're very much aligned with the U.S. and other Western democracies.
Right.
But then you've got India. And under their current leadership, they've been moving closer to Russia and China.
So you've got these bigger power struggles already happening, and then this India-Canada dispute is like, I don't know, throwing fuel on the fire.
Yeah, it's adding fuel to an already pretty volatile situation. And it really raises the question of, could this incident push India even further away from the West?
Right.
Could this strengthen their ties with countries that, frankly, the West sees as rivals?
Yeah. And then to make things even more complicated, it's like we've seen these attempts to kind of cool things down a little, haven't we?
There have been, yeah,
Yeah.
reports of back-channeling, officials from both sides trying to quietly find a way to de-escalate the situation. There was even, I think, talk about India quietly resuming some visa processing after initially suspending it entirely.
Which, on the surface, you'd think that's a good sign, right? But
But
then,
then you have Canadian officials coming out and saying, quite publicly, that the threat of violence against Sikhs in Canada is very real.
yeah.
This isn't some abstract thing.
Right.
And that obviously complicates things even further, adds a whole other layer of risk to this whole situation.
Yeah, it does feel like walking a tightrope a little bit because on the one hand, you're trying to, repair these diplomatic ties. But on the other hand, you have a responsibility to ensure the safety and security of your own citizens. It's a tough spot to be in.
It really is. And it highlights how this situation, it isn't just about governments and diplomats, This is impacting real people. And particularly, it's impacting people within the Sikh community.
And that's something I did want to circle back to, actually, because you mentioned the Sikh diaspora earlier. I'd be curious to hear, what their perspective has been throughout all of this, because I imagine it's pretty diverse.
Oh, incredibly diverse. I mean, you have some within the Sikh community who strongly support the Khalistan movement. They see Nijar as a martyr for their cause.
Right.
And then you have others who condemn the violence and they want to see justice served through legal means. And of course, there are many who are kind of caught in the middle, feeling pressure from both sides.
So it's creating these divisions even within the community itself.
Absolutely. A lot of tension, a lot of division. And I think it underscores the importance of really engaging with this issue with nuance and sensitivity. It's really easy to get caught up in the headlines, the political rhetoric. But we have to remember, this is about real human lives.
It's not just some political chess match. It's about people's lives, their families, their communities.
Exactly. And it really makes you wonder, where do we go from here? Can India and Canada rebuild trust? Or will this incident cast a long shadow on their relationship, push them further apart on the world stage?
It's a question, like you said, that we're all going to be grappling with, I think, for some time. So for those of us who are trying to kind of wrap our heads around it all as this story continues to unfold, what should we be paying attention to?
I think keep an eye out for any signs of a thaw in the relationship. Are there concrete steps being taken to address the security concerns of both sides? Is there a willingness to engage in dialogue, maybe find some common ground? Or are we going to see a doubling down, further escalation, a hardening of positions?
Because it's a lot to process, but I think that's why it's so important to try to understand, the nuances, the history, the potential consequences. It's easy to just get overwhelmed by the news cycle, but I think these kinds of deep dives, they help to kind of connect the dots.
They really do. And I think at the end of the day, they remind us that even these really complex international events are ultimately about choices. Human choices,
Right.
and what those choices lead to.
Choices that have real-world implications for all of us.
Yeah.
Well said. So, as always, stay informed, stay engaged, and keep asking those critical questions.